Order, order. Cameron Thomas to move motion.
I beg to move that this House has considered the dedicated schools grant. It's an honour to serve under your chairship, Ms Butler. I thank the F40 group for their assistance with this issue, those who have attended the debate and the Minister for her presence, which is greatly appreciated. I bring this debate forward on behalf of my head teachers, teaching staff, support staff and young people across Gloucestershire and those other local authorities amongst the lowest funded councils by the Department for Education across England. In its 2024 manifesto, Labour pledged to transform our education system so that young people get the opportunities they deserve. There is a clear alignment in that with the Liberal Democrats' commitment to increase per-pupil funding above the rate of inflation every year. Our goal is to support all pupils and expand educational provision, not to shift resources away from more disadvantaged counties like Gloucestershire. Schools in my constituency are faced with increased pressure right now owing to the inequitable dedicated schools grant, combined with the rising costs of special educational needs. Consecutive governments have failed our children because, with short-term mindsets, they have not adequately resourced education, through which our children could otherwise go on to boost every workplace across the country. Those governments left our children to emerge into a country where every public service is crumbling, but in which you need a university degree to become a police officer. Where Brexit took away our children's access to Erasmus and left a bitterly divided society. A society which is still struggling to readjust following the COVID-19 pandemic. When Sir Kevin Collins recommended a £13.5 billion COVID catch-up fund for our children, Boris Johnson's government fielded only 1/10 of that figure, and after so thoughtlessly spending billions on botched PPE contracts. Our children continue to suffer the consequences of that decision through a mental health crisis, an explosion in SEND demand, and almost 1 million young adults not in work, education or training. I entered politics because I believe in fairness, and I believe that whatever else we do in this place, there are two routes through which we can improve the future of our country: through political, including electoral reform, and through education, education, education. Within every child lies the potential for greatness, the potential to solve tomorrow what seems impossible today. Our children represent our hope for the future. They are yet unburdened by the decades of dogma, societal pressure, and institutional inequity which weigh upon us and dilute our own potential. In every aspect of our lives, we must strive to prepare the ground ahead of them and leave them a better country, a better world than was passed to us. Our teachers recognise this more clearly than any of us. They dedicate their careers to the fulfilment of our children's potential because there is no more rewarding pursuit than to help others to develop. No salary compares to being thanked in the street by those you helped and watching with pride as they go above and beyond what they imagined they could. Labour's 2024 manifesto described teaching as a hard-earned and hard-learned skill and pledged to work to raise its status. I commend both the observation and the commitment, but we are continuing to fail our teachers too. Our teachers are no longer simply expected to educate our children according to the curriculum. Governments and society continue to expect more and more of our already overburdened teachers. I'd be delighted to.
Would my honourable friend agree that teachers and teaching assistants at schools are the first line of defence against cuts to public services from the last Conservative government, and that actually the DfE, when they are asking schools to make efficiencies alongside the extra funding that they have had, means that some TAs will lose their jobs as a result? In fact, last week in my constituency of Esher and Walton, I walked into a school on a school visit and the head teacher just had to let 2 TAs go because his school is facing a deficit of £200,000.
Cameron Thomas.
I commend my honourable friend for her intervention. I wholeheartedly agree, and I hope she'll pass on my empathy to her head teacher, and I'll be coming to just that point shortly. Our teachers are no longer simply expected to educate our children according to the curriculum. Governments and society continue to expect more and more of our already overburdened teachers. Increasingly, 4-year-olds are being introduced to school non-verbal, unable to use cutlery, and sometimes wearing nappies. But those are just the headlines. Discipline, time management, self and social awareness, self and mutual respect, moral courage, honesty, work ethic, public service, charity. These soft skills and attributes should be introduced in the home and honed within society as well as at school. And this government, with honest intentions towards our children's healthcare, now has teachers cleaning their pupils' teeth, just one additional straw upon the camel's back. It's no wonder that teaching assistant posts are vacated or lie empty when people can earn more working in the local supermarket. I understand that fixing the education system will be complex, expensive, and that action must also take place beyond the scope of the Department for Education. But something that can be addressed now is a more equitable allocation of funding. This will go a long way to remedying the situation for many schools in Gloucestershire and elsewhere. The Dedicated Schools Grant is the mechanism through which the Department for Education funds local authorities, which in turn allocate their resources to the schools within their jurisdiction.
Will my right honourable friend give way?
I'd be delighted to. Thank you.
Darling.
Thank you for giving way. One school in my constituency of Torbay has a £100,000 bill of due to the national insurance hike that is resulting in redundancies. Would my colleague agree with me that the national insurance hike is just exacerbating the inequity that many of our schools face in our local communities?
Cameron Thomas.
I thank my honourable friend, and I entirely agree with his statements. I have long been speaking out against the short-sightedness of that national insurance hike, and again I will come back to the short-termism that I think it's so important this government escapes. The Dedicated Schools Grant, it's allocated according to the national funding formula, which is outdated and which puts schools such as mine in Gloucestershire under increased pressure. Mainstream schools in the lowest funded local authority receive £5,000 less per pupil per year than they do in the highest funded authority. My mainstream...
My honourable friend give way.
Yes, please.
I'm grateful for my honourable friend for giving way. In Oxfordshire, we only receive a area cost adjustment of just 2%, so that's to take into account the difference in cost of living in different parts of the country. In London boroughs, it reaches 18%, and that's simply does not match the cost of living in Oxfordshire, where house prices are very much comparable to London. Does he share my concerns, therefore, that this lack of funding is impacting the education of our children?
I thank my honourable friend for his intervention. As somebody who was, let's be generous and say, barely educated in Oxfordshire himself, I'm very much aware of the issue. My mainstream schools in Gloucestershire fall into the bottom 20% of DSG funding, earning £1,000 less per pupil than schools in the top 20. This means, for example, that Cleve School, with its 1,851 pupils, faces an approximate annual deficit of over £1.8 million compared with a similarly sized school, for example, in Middlesbrough. Please.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way and agree with all of the points that he's making so far. This morning I spoke to the headmaster of Thomas Hardy School in Dorchester in my constituency. His previous job was at a London Borough School in Croydon, where he told me that on average he received £10,000 per pupil. In West Dorset that figure is £5,000. Does my honourable friend agree with me that the government's funding formula for schools does not take into account the added cost of rurality, the added cost of providing services in places like West Dorset, and no doubt in his own constituency?
Cameron Thomas.
I thank my honourable friend from West Dorset, and with such gravity he says it better than I could ever hope to. Certainly the inequity is there for all to see, and it's interesting that one of his own teachers has experienced both ends of that scale. My own 4-year-old daughter and her friends will begin their primary school education in Gloucestershire in September. I want them to have, as Labour manifesto put it, the opportunities they deserve. To me, that means the same opportunities as every other child. But by the time they finish their GCSEs under this inequitable system, the Dedicated Schools Grant will have invested between £10,000 and £50,000 less in our children than those elsewhere in the country. The government might point to an upward trend in the Dedicated Schools Grant in Gloucestershire since 2021, but on the current trajectory, it will take 15 years to achieve equity. By then, My daughter and her friends will have long since left school. Unless the government acts now, their potential will have been diluted by the dedicated schools grant as is. By the time we achieve equity, according to trends based on the government's own statistics, the vast majority of those teaching today will have retired. My head teachers have told me that for most schools, approximately 85% of their funding is ring-fenced for staffing costs, but that rises to over 90% in some particularly desperate cases. The level of teaching experience in our schools is diminishing because our head teachers are having to make their most experienced and highly paid teachers redundant so that they can recruit less experienced teachers on lower wages just to balance the books.
Would the honourable member give way?
Yes, of course I will.
I thank you for giving way. In West Sussex, the deficit on our DSG grant at the moment is 130 million, and it will potentially double by next year. Yet, despite that, SEND provision, which is the main driver of that deficit, is deficient across the district. I have so many schools approaching me on this subject. Does he agree that we need not just to find some way of wiping out the deficit, but also removing the fundamental cause, which is ballooning costs of SEND provision?
I thank him, and he makes eloquent points. Clearly, the SEND crisis is exacerbating this to a significant degree, and I think what we are really looking for from the government is a long-term strategic plan to deal with this rather than just to push it down the line. Since 2014, mainstream schools are required to attribute the initial £6,000 of additional costs for SEND pupils from their own core budget. Owing to the inequity in the DSG, it's easy to see why this has a greater impact on those schools in lower funded authorities. Resources have become so stretched, many teaching assistants are only available to support pupils with the greatest SEND requirements. Underfunded primary and senior schools are taking drastic actions to balance the books. One primary school head that I spoke with spends his holidays in school, completing the tasks of a caretaker that he can no longer afford to employ. Across Gloucestershire, there is nothing left to cut. Head teachers are overwhelmed and cannot afford to meet the costs of any pay rise which may arise from the government's negotiations with teaching unions. The impact of an unfunded pay rise, I have been told, would be ruinous. Chair, I will conclude shortly. I recognise that this government inherited an utterly broken country from the Conservative Party which preceded it. It was a hospital pass, but almost a year down the line, my teachers remain on the front line of a genuine crisis to which they have been given no real answers. They don't have time for more politics as usual. They don't have another 15 years for this system to reach equity, and neither do they need more short-termism. They need their government to step up now, and with long-term solutions which don't simply pass these challenges down the line. In order to support teachers and enable them to plan for the future, rather than simply to stave off financial collapse, I'm asking the government today to please review the national funding formula and target funding to achieve near-term equity. Once again, Ms Butler, I thank you for chairing this debate, and I look forward to the contributions of others and the Minister's response.
The question is that this House has considered dedicated schools grant. Richard Ford.
Review in the chair. Let me start with a simple fact. Devon is one of the worst funded educational authorities in the country. For the year 2024-25, Devon is receiving just £5,484 per pupil. That's about £200 less than the national average and about £1,500 less than a pupil might in London. And I experienced this through the eyes of teachers who I've talked to in Devon who've taught both in inner London and in rural Devon. And they describe to me the difference that the funding makes. For an average Devon primary school, this equates to losing the budget for one whole teacher. Devon is an F40 authority, one of the 40 lowest funded areas in England, and the national funding formula was supposed to level the playing field. But it has left schools in areas like East and Mid Devon struggling. Nowhere is the crisis more obvious than in special educational needs. Devon's high needs block allocation for 25-26 is £125 million, but the anticipated cost of supporting SEND children is £172 million. And this is a funding gap that up to now has been filled by the so-called safety valve, but one that I understand might not have that safety valve relief in 2026 and onwards. If we compare Devon's high needs allocation per pupil to a council like Camden, we see a real disparity. Camden, or perhaps Westminster, that receives £2,610 per pupil against Devon's £1,245 per pupil. So Devon is being asked to deliver special educational needs on half the budget. Let me share with you the story of one family that's affected. Catherine Radley lives in Upline, in the area I represent, and her daughter Sophia is autistic. Sophia was at one point offered just 6 hours a week of online education, and her family had to borrow money just to keep that minimal support going when the council did not fund it. The Education, Health and Care Plan, the EHCP, that was issued for her was unworkable. It didn't name a school. It wasn't supported by any deliverable provision. And Sophia, who didn't misbehave, didn't disrupt class, who simply needed specialist support, was left isolated at home with anxiety, with no place in the system. Devon is currently spending £55 million on SEND private provision, that is, SEND in the private sector. And this is an area that is not properly audited and not properly scrutinised. Meanwhile, state schools in the area I represent, like in Honiton, in Westminster, in Sidmouth, are crying out for more resources to support special educational needs, more teaching assistants, more specialist hubs, more early intervention services. But they can't because the EHCP issues with funding per pupil that is far less than elsewhere. What we therefore see is teachers who are overwhelmed, too few teaching assistants, staff who are prioritising behavioural cases over inclusion, so that many children, like the one I've described, simply cannot cope. Devon needs urgent and fairer funding for its schools from the dedicated schools grant. We need to expand local SEND resource bases and give mainstream schools the tools they need to include every child. Indeed, the Department for Education should give Devon's children the funding for education that they deserve. Thank you.
Joe Morris.
Thank you. Congratulate the Honourable Member for securing this important debate. I think for far too long the state of rural and semi-rural schools has been particularly forgotten, particularly in my part of Northumberland, where Northumberland County Council, still run by the Conservatives, I think treats my part of the county with what I'd only describe as tender contempt. And the previous government thought so little of my constituency. They built a school 8.5 years ago that is already deemed structurally unsafe, and we've had to see students transported to another part of the North East to continue their education. So I just want to situate my remarks in the context of that. Generations of rural students have indeed been left behind, and I thank the Honourable Gentleman for his circumspectness in his opening comments about the awful circumstances this government has inherited. I don't think it's possible to start any discussion of any policy without recognising that we did have a generational hospital pass, I think as he put it. Having grown up in a rural area myself, there are foundational characteristics. I confess not knowing too much about Gloucestershire, having not had the chance to go there myself much, beyond for I think one family funeral when I was about 10, but I'm sure it's lovely. But Northumberland has a lot similar from what I can tell. It's large distances to travel, restricted access to opportunities and services. I went back to my old high school recently, discussed some of the access to work schemes that they try and provide, some of the opportunities for younger people to get employment skills. They are hamstrung. The teachers are working every hour that they get, but they are hamstrung by simply a lack of local bus routes, a lack of appropriate public transport, a lack of employers who have the capacity to take on apprentices or to take on students who are in need of that work experience. For far too long, I think in the 100 years that my constituency had Conservative representation down here, those challenges were not given voice, they were not addressed. It was the challenges of being, dare I say, considered a safe Tory seat that you simply were considered to vote for your MP and not get a voice as a part of that. But ultimately, we need to do more to engender stronger ties between communities, between schools, making sure that those growing up in our communities do not have to search too far outside them to find the opportunities, the jobs they want to progress in life. Unfortunately, that's the reality for many students, and I'll direct the remainder of my remarks to two particular schools. First of all, Haydenbridge High School is an incredible school in a beautiful location. I get to visit a lot of schools. Haydenbridge is a wonderful town on the Tyne Valley Railway line, although the Tyne Valley Railway line could run on time a little bit more. But it is a fantastic school with genuinely fantastic teachers. Unfortunately, I've discussed the funding issues with the head teacher. I would dearly like to see the new administration at Northumberland County Hall put their hands in their pocket and do something about the state of that school. It has been underfunded for a very long time. There has not been the political will, the political nous, the political leadership in Morpeth, in the Conservative group, to actually stand up for students in the West of Northumberland. And then finally, just to turn once again to those teachers at Haydenbridge. As I said, they could not work any harder. They could not be putting on more opportunities. They are always looking at how they can make the school more attractive, how they can drive employment, drive employability. But for far too long, the voice of rural schools has been shut out of the national debate. And then to return to Product Community High School. Opened 8.5 years ago, built under a Conservative Secretary of State and a Conservative Education Department, closed due to cracks in the infrastructure. Now, I've been working with the staff and with the community in Prodo on that. Again, you would struggle to find a more inspiring group of people than, and particularly the head teacher and the teaching staff there, who have dealt with cracks appearing in the structure months before GCSE time, months before A-levels, and have had to deal with an incredibly challenging situation. And they've done it to the best of their ability. Now, everyone accepts the ultimate best outcome would have been for the students to be able to go back into that high school, to go back to receive their education on site. That would not have been safe. They have had to work incredibly hard to find an appropriate site that does involve travel, but one that enables the students to continue their education safely. And I would just urge the Minister that as she goes back and looks not just at the matters being raised in this debate, but to consider, as I know she has many times because I've chased her down corridors, to consider the circumstances of those at Product Community High School. I'd also put that to the exam boards, because I do believe that those students have had a really kind of black swan event in terms of their school being deemed unsafe so close to exam times. I know some of those exam boards have said that it falls under a RAC school. I don't personally believe that, and I want to put that on the record. But for far too long, schools in my constituency in the West of Northumberland have been forgotten about, have been done down, and it is beyond time that those responsible, particularly at County Hall, stand up and take note. Thank you.
Great. Can I just remind members, if they do want to speak in the debate, if they could please stand. We're calculated maybe 5 minutes per speech. Claire Young, thank you.
It's an honour to serve under your chairship, and I'd also like to thank the member for Tewkesbury for securing this debate. Investing in education is investing in our future, so we need to get it right. The current national funding formula creates huge discrepancies between how children are supported in different authorities. My own local authority, South Gloucestershire, has long been at or near the bottom of the funding league table, and that lack of investment is having a real impact on our children. Thornbury and Yates is largely rural, but most of the rest of South Gloucestershire is urban. It has generally been the case with all sorts of government funding, that when taken as a whole, it has suffered through not being rural enough for rural support, but also not having the concentrations of deprivation seen in some urban areas. Even within my constituency, there's a huge variation in the demographics of schools' intakes. I've recently written to the Minister about the case of one primary school I visited in my constituency that provides a good example of the pressures being caused by the current unfairness within the funding system. They told me how they've developed a reputation for being particularly supportive of children with SEND needs, and thus have an unusually high proportion of children requiring extra support. On top of this, they're being asked to support increasingly high levels of medical needs, which the already overstretched staff are not trained to meet. They also have a very high number of children with English as a second language, and a third of their pupils qualify for pupil premium funding. In many ways, their intake is comparable to a school they visited in London, Yet that school gets much higher per pupil funding simply because of the local authority it is in. This shows in the services the London School is able to provide, from specialist art and music teachers to having 2 teachers per class. Our children in Thornbury and Yate deserve more than the funding currently provides. This disparity is undermining the work our local schools do and leaving them worse off. We need a fairer national funding formula that supports disadvantaged and rural schools, not just those in more affluent and urban areas, and recognises the wide variation within local authority boundaries. We also need action on funding for SEND. Of course.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. I 100% agree with the point that she's making. I have no doubt that in her constituency, as with mine, you have a similar problem where when the government talks about a fully funded pay increase, it is based on the average of a school. And in many rural places, we don't have the average because, in fact, we have smaller class sizes or we have single large schools covering a large geographical area and a large number of pupils. And those are heavily disadvantaged as a result of this.
Thank you, and I absolutely agree. I mean, it's particularly a problem for small rural schools, which often have very small class sizes because overall they're very small. We also need action on funding for special education needs and disabilities, as too many children are being left without the support they need. For years, schools in South Gloucestershire have had to ask government to allow them to take money from the schools block to supplement the high needs block. This reduces the funding available for early intervention, which we know is so important to better outcomes, and makes the SEND funding situation worse as more children need higher cost interventions at a later stage. The high needs block must be protected and expanded to reflect growing demand and rising complexity in children's needs. And South Gloucestershire is one of the authorities with a safety valve agreement intended to help councils manage large deficits in their high needs budgets. It was signed pre-COVID, with targets that are completely unachievable thanks to the impact of the pandemic. And next year, the council faces a cliff edge in funding when the agreement ends. They and other councils in this position face impossible choices between balancing budgets and supporting vulnerable children. Furthermore, in the case of South Gloucestershire, the previous Conservative government failed to provide the requested £30 million funding to provide an additional 200 special school placements locally, which, as well as being better for the children, would reduce costs. I had a meeting with the Minister and South Gloucestershire Council leadership earlier this year in the hopes that this government would take a more sensible approach, but the focus seems to be on providing spaces in mainstream. We support that as a goal, with extra funding for early intervention to make it possible, while recognising that there are children who need support now who did not get that early intervention, and we also need funding for them. So I would ask ministers to think again about what works now, because otherwise another generation of our children will miss out. Without a solution to the ending of the safety valve agreements, the whole system could collapse, leading to longer waits, reduced provision and more children out of school. We need sustainable long-term funding for high needs and an end to short-term financial firefighting.
Sarah Dyke.
Thank you, Ms Butler. It's a pleasure to speak in this important debate and to serve with you in the chair. And I congratulate my honourable friend for Tewkesbury for securing this important debate and for his powerful speech. I'd like to alert members to my position as one of the vice-chairs of the F40 group, which represents 43 local authorities with historically low funding for education and campaigns for fairer funding for schools and SEND provision. Ms Butler, Somerset is one of these councils. Their 26 dedicated schools grant allocation is just £8,500 per student, while some councils get nearly £5,000 more than that per pupil. The launch of the national funding formula for mainstream schools in 2018 introduced a minimum per pupil funding level designed to level up funding. However, this has continued to lock in historical funding elements, preventing some local authority areas from receiving more funding. The Liberal Democrats understand the need for regional variation to ensure that schools can operate successfully, but this shouldn't come at the expense of schools elsewhere that often struggle to make ends meet. As other honourable members have stated, the DSG is made up of 4 blocks. One of these is the high needs block that supports SEND provision for children in both mainstream and specialist schools. Somerset's 2025-2026 allocation of high needs block funding is £1,250 per student, over £2,000 less than the highest funded local authority. Now, it's been stressed many times that the SEND system is broken, and the variance of unequal funding of DSG is a big reason for this. My inbox, like many other members here today, is full of correspondence from parents who are they all desperately want the best education for their children, but they're concerned and indeed deeply upset that their children's needs are not being met by their schools. Yes, of course.
Thank my honourable friend for giving way. My area, Harrogate and Knaresborough, is North Yorkshire Council, and it similarly is one of those areas of the F40 you've actually mentioned. We on the high needs funding, we're 146 out of 151, I think it is, in terms of the lowest funding that we receive. That's causing real challenges in the context of a rural setting, with children having to travel for hours sometimes to get to school. I wondered if she shares my concerns about this low levels of funding, and then when it's compacted by the fact that we've seen a cut to rural services delivery grant that local authorities receive too.
My honourable friend finished intervention. Indeed, I will touch on that, but absolutely delivering education in a huge rural county. There are so many pressures, so many complexities within that, and he's absolutely right to bring that up. And if I can just give an example, or I'll give a couple of examples of children who are suffering and their education isn't being met in my constituency of Glastonbury and Somerton. One of them is Jensen from Ilchester. He's only 7 years old, but he's been experiencing severe mental health distress while awaiting a long overdue neurodevelopmental assessment. His mother told me that he's lost all enjoyment in life, and he's missing his education and he's missing his friends. And all the while he's being passed between services and services. But Jensen isn't alone in this situation. Many other children in Glastonbury and Somerton are facing similar challenges. Charlie, for example, from Castle Carey. Now, he's got an EHCP, but his school are simply not able to meet his needs. His mother said that he's been left for months without his educational needs, as specified in his EHCP, being met. And as a result, his behaviour at school and his mental health are declining. The differential in DSG funding means that children like Jensen and Charlie and many others, heartbreakingly, just can't get the support that they deserve. And Ms Butler, families are being left to suffer alone, fighting a system that just isn't working for them. We know the system is broken. However, the ISOS report released last year found that all actors within the system are behaving rationally, so schools, councils and parents, but the system just isn't up to scratch. The funding model needs to be reformed to make it more responsive to changes, so individual schools can receive the funding that is based on need. So I urge the Minister to consider reviewing the funding formulas for both schools and high needs. Ms Butler, the Liberal Democrats have a plan to invest in our education sector above the rate of inflation, so we can ensure all schools have the capacity to operate sustainably. This also means that we must give our local authorities the financial support that they need. The previous Conservative government left schools to crumble and forced councils to do more with less, impacting our children's education. The consistent budgetary strain doesn't allow local authorities to create long-term plans for children with SEND. So we would also set up a dedicated national body for SEND to act as a champion for children with complex needs and ensure they receive tailored support. Without major reforms and changes to funding, we will continue to see a landscape with uneven funding where children are badly let down and schools cannot provide the support needed. So I urge the Minister to take action, invest in education, invest in our children and invest in our future.
Gideon Amos.
Thank you, Ms Butler. It's a pleasure to serve with you in the chair, and I'd like to congratulate my honourable friend, the member for Tewkesbury, on what is a really important debate and bringing us all together for this debate and to highlight the inequity of the system that built up under the previous Conservative government and became more and more entrenched over those years. And I'm only sorry that there aren't more members on the Conservative benches to come and pay attention to this issue today, which is a huge factor in the well-being of our children and all our constituencies up and down the country. Somerset, as my honourable friend, member for Glastonbury and Somerton, has pointed out, is one of the F40 local authorities, receiving and therefore one of the worst funded local educational authorities. A child educated here in Westminster would be receiving £4,000 more per pupil than children in Somerset, in my Taunton and Wellington constituency. At the same time, the demand for sending somewhere like Somerset has risen enormously. 60% increase in placements since between 2014-15 and 2023-2024. And as a result, provision in Somerset, as well as in a lot of other places, is frankly unacceptable, is not good enough, and it needs to change. Historical special educational needs funding is part of, and the pattern for the national funding formula is part of the problem. The spending should be purely based on current local need and not on historic need, as the Institute of Fiscal Studies has pointed out in a really important report. It says the use of historical spending patterns as a factor in the high needs national funding formula also helped to cement geographical inequalities in high needs funding that has arisen over time. It goes on. The historical spend element determines 25% of the overall formula allocation and drives a large element of the variation in funding across areas. This bakes in arbitrary differences in council funding that have arisen over time and leads to large variability in funding per high needs pupil across councils. On the high needs block, part of the direct schools grant in particular, it says the present high needs funding system introduced in 2018 when numbers were mostly stable, and it incorporates many historical measures of need and spending that already drive substantial geographic differences in spending per pupil. It is ill-designed for the present context of rising need. With regard to high needs funding, more than 20% of funding is based on a local authority's historic spending, which bears no resemblance to today's funding landscape. As the Institute of Fiscal Studies have pointed out, it urgently needs reform. And part of the problem, of course, as part of that, is the problem of local government funding generally. In Somerset, 2 out of every £3 of council tax goes on care, whether that's for adult social care or care for children, including special educational needs funding. It's no wonder the outgoing leader of Conservative leader of Somerset County Council described it as a time bomb that was ticking and is going to unfortunately likely go off and affect our children and our families across Somerset, who are suffering the consequences of that legacy, which our councillors are now trying to deal with. And as my honourable friend for Harrogate and Knaresborough pointed out, the withdrawal of the Rural Service Delivery Grant has also compounded more problems and challenges on authorities like Somerset, which have a low property-based value across the county compared to property values in other parts of the country, to have historically low income levels as a result. The national funding formula, therefore, has to be improved. And the F40 organisation, I congratulate my honourable friend, member for Glastonbury and Somerton, for her work with the F40 organisation. They've recommended government is aware of the unfairness and has indicated it wishes to level up, but it is a very slow process, and at the current rate will take around 20 years for equitable funding to be established. That is a whole generation of children. Children should have the same opportunities and resources regardless of where they live or go to school. And I'm sure members across the House would agree with that. So I really urge the Minister to make good on that promise to reform the system. 3 things need to be done in particular. We need greater support within schools for special educational needs children, so that will save costs later on. We all know early intervention matters to younger children and has the most effect. Secondly, we need more hubs locally providing specialist provision and not relying on the private unregistered school sector for much of our special educational needs provision, which of course is highly costly and also not serving their best interests because it means transporting pupils long distances. And we do need more investment, which comes back to reform of the national funding formula. Liberal Democrats want to see reform of local government funding and social care funding in particular, but also above inflation increases in school funding and a dedicated national SEND authority. That's the kind of reform we need to see in this Parliament. I hope very much the government will be delivering it.
Steph Ackroyd.
Pleasure to serve under your chairship, and I refer members to the register of interest as a serving Norfolk County Councillor. Across all the areas that the DSG exists to support, Norfolk is struggling. Early years settings in North Norfolk are under mounting pressures from the national insurance hike, rising wages and spiralling costs. For many providers, there simply isn't enough money coming in to match what they need to survive. It's estimated that 80% of the income from early years settings now comes from government-funded childcare. So when that funding doesn't match what's needed, then these settings get into deep trouble. And in North Norfolk, we can't afford to lose them. Without childcare for working-age parents in my rural constituency, we will see families who have cherished the areas for generations forced to move. The risk of a demographic doom spiral is huge. If schools and nurseries close, then working-age people won't be able to work and have families. Working families can't survive and thrive in rural North Norfolk, then people won't have children, something we're already seeing an alarming pattern of. Those with children won't come here. If there are no children, then there'll be no working-age people of tomorrow. And that goes for all children of all ages, abilities and aptitudes. This is a worrying, slippery slope for our area economically and in terms of supporting vital services like adult social care too. Good, accessible, affordable childcare is a basis on which we can build our rural economy. That's why, as a candidate, I marched 10 miles in protest at the closure of the childcare provision in Wells, and we got it reopened thanks to the hard work of parents. It's also why just last week I've been protesting the proposed closure of East Ruston Nursery with worried local parents who depend upon it. Early years provision is an often undervalued but utterly vital part of our education system, and I'm fighting to protect it in North Norfolk. Meanwhile, Norfolk's SEND provision is in crisis. The current system isn't helping schools or parents or teachers or the local authority. Demand is rapidly outstripping supply, and Norfolk County Council was at last count running a deficit in the high needs block approaching £60 million. This is completely unsustainable, and we have to change the way our system supports these children and young people to give them a far better experience and set up for the rest of their lives. I recently met a mother and her son in one of my constituency surgeries. He was a very smart, engaging and insightful young man. I shared excellent conversations with him about video game development and computing, and his talent and potential shone through. However, the system has failed him. He's been out of education for 3 years, and his mother is currently battling with the tribunal system to try and get him access to formal education again. The toll it has taken on both of them is clear, and it's completely unacceptable. He's not alone, however, in facing circumstances like this. It pains me to think about a lost generation of talented and passionate young people who could miss out on bright futures because of the crisis in SEND provision. Trust has broken down, and we have to do better. We need to enable and encourage more mainstream inclusion for those for whom it's possible. We need to review the tribunal system, which is putting unnecessary stress on families and often producing unworkable outcomes for local authorities. And we need to better support schools and how they can get the best out of these pupils by ensuring that criteria for their inspection incentivises high-quality inclusion and looks at the readiness of pupils to learn, not just their paper performance. Norfolk's families were failed for many years by a disastrous duo, a Conservative government and a Conservative-led county council. They've got rid of that government, and I've no doubt they'd have got rid of the Conservatives on the council too if they hadn't had their elections snatched away from them. I'm proud to stand side by side with the parents and children who are demanding better for their futures, and I'll be holding the government to account, as well as the county council, to make sure this is delivered.
Thank you. Lib Dem spokesperson in Solom.
Thank you, Ms Butler. It's an honour to serve under you as chair this afternoon. And I would like to thank my honourable friend, the MP for Tewkesbury, for securing this debate today and for his frankly powerful speech. The individuals he mentions, the school staff he represents, and indeed educators and local authorities across the country grappling with similar financial challenges will surely welcome him putting the spotlight on this pressing issue.
Thank you.
He's quite right that the pressure on all schools, and in turn on the staff working in them, has increased significantly over recent years. That is both in terms of the pressures of educating pupils with different and sometimes complex needs, as well as the financial pressure of operating on budgets that simply don't stretch far enough in a time of high and rising costs all over the country. I would be surprised if there is a single MP that hasn't had head teachers in their constituency tell them of the impossible choices they are facing, as I have in St Neots and mid-Cambridgeshire. And at the heart of this crisis lies a fundamental injustice, an outdated and deeply flawed mechanism for allocating the dedicated schools grant. The national funding formula developed years ago and based mainly on the typical distribution of funding provided by local authorities at that time, and further ossified by funding protections, has created a postcode lottery that fails children and communities. And let's be clear what that means in practice. Similar comparative schools in different parts of the country can receive dramatically different levels of support. And that affects a wide range of children, including those living in pockets of deprivation in generally wealthier parts of the country that tend to receive lower dedicated schools grant funding. And whilst we do know that there are other mechanisms to mitigate that, it ultimately means that a child with specific needs in one area can receive significantly less support than a child from a similar background and with the same needs in another area. And that's not just administratively untidy, it's fundamentally wrong. Now, the organisation F40 that's been mentioned by several of my friends amongst the Lib Dems today, representing those lowest funded educational authorities in England, and now counting 43 of them in its membership, is not, that's not a small anomaly for them. It's a systemic failure that affects hundreds of thousands of school children who are being denied the education they deserve through absolutely no fault of their own. And indeed, Madam Chair, in my own constituency of St Neots and mid-Cambridgeshire, we also feel this acutely. Cambridgeshire ranks 133rd out of 151 local authorities in the funding allocation. Our schools receive £6,133 per pupil in the schools block element, compared to the national average of £6,467. If Cambridgeshire schools were funded at the equivalent level as our neighbours in Lincolnshire, a typical primary in my constituency would receive an additional £118,000 per year. And compared to another neighbour, Peterborough, Cambridgeshire would see £33 million in additional funding if the playing field were level. Meanwhile, the demand for EHCPs has grown fast, rising by 91% in Cambridgeshire since 2017, which far outpaces the 72% increase in funding for the high needs block over the same period. That widening gulf means more children waiting longer for vital support, more pressure on already stretched staff, and more families reaching breaking point. Now, Liberal Democrats believe that equal opportunity in education isn't a luxury, it's a fundamental right. Every child deserves access to the same resources and opportunities, regardless of their postcode. And while we understand that regional variation has its place, indeed, we champion the pupil premium funding to direct resources towards disadvantaged children. This should not have come at the expense of creating the current disparities. The problem is reaching breaking point, with schools expected to somehow fund teacher pay rises from existing budgets. Those with lower DSG allocations face impossible choices: cutting staff, reducing subjects, or eliminating those enrichment activities that are vital to a well-rounded education. The Liberal Democrat solution is clear. We would invest in education above the rate of inflation, ensuring all schools can operate sustainably regardless of geography. And we would expand free school meals to all children on universal credit, relieving pressure on family budgets, and place a dedicated mental health professional in every school, recognising that well-being and academic achievement are inextricably linked. Madam Chair, pupil needs have evolved dramatically, and our funding system needs to evolve with them. The time for just tinkering at the edges of this formula has passed. We need a comprehensive reform that guarantees an equal base level of funding for all pupils, with appropriate additional support reflecting specific school, pupil and area needs. Our children deserve nothing less. Thank you.
Thank you. Opposition spokesperson Rebecca Paul.
Thank you. It is a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, Ms Butler, and may I draw attention to my register of interests. I am pleased to respond today on behalf of the opposition in what has been an important and thoughtful debate. I thank the Honourable Member for Tewkesbury, and I completely agree with his opening remarks with respect to the importance of teaching children in the home as well as in the school. Indeed, it is clear from all the contributions we have heard this afternoon that across all political divides, we share a clear desire to see all children, regardless of location, background or complexity of needs, accessing high-quality education in a setting that supports their potential. That vision, of course, depends very heavily on a fair and sufficient funding for our schools. As we have heard, the dedicated schools grant is at the heart of this. Before turning to the particular concerns raised today, though, it would be appropriate to briefly review some of the principal achievements from the last government in this space, all of which have a bearing on any debate around the dedicated schools grant. Honourable members will recall that it was a Conservative government which took the step of reforming school funding through the introduction of the national funding formula, thereby ending the postcode lottery that for too long left similar schools receiving vastly different allocations. The national funding formula delivered greater transparency, a demonstrably fairer methodology, and drew a clearer line between the needs of pupils and the funding schools received. However, as the Honourable Member has set out, there are clearly still some disparities, and I think it's right that we look at those and consider what can be done to address that, and I look forward to hearing the Minister's view on that. It was also a Conservative government that increased core schools funding to record levels. Between 2010 and 2023, funding per pupil rose in real terms, with particular investment going into the high needs block of the dedicated schools grant. In fact, by the final year of the previous government, we had delivered a £10 billion increase in overall schools funding compared to 2019 to 20, including a £4 billion increase to the high needs budget, bringing total high needs funding to £10.5 billion in 2023 to 2024. We backed that up with targeted support for pupils with SEND through capital investment focused on expanding special school places and improving facilities across the country. And it was this party that took decisive action to address poor quality provision, cracking down on unregistered settings and increasing the powers of local authorities and Ofsted to take action where provision fell short. Our approach was unambiguously vindicated as England soared up the PISA league tables between 2009 to 2022 in maths, English and science. In that period, the league table showed that England went from 21st to 7th on maths, from 19th to 9th for reading, and from 11th to 9th on science. Moreover, in December 2023, children in England were named best in the West for reading, and in December 2024, they were ranked the best at maths in the Western world in the 2023 TIM study. Regrettably, where England has surged in international education rankings, Labour-led Wales has slumped. Whilst England went from 21st to 7th in maths, Wales went from 29th to 27th. Whilst England went from 19th to 9th for reading, Wales stayed at 28th. Whilst England went from 11th to 9th on science, Wales slumped from 21st to 29th. Ultimately, whether in England or Wales, there will always be more to do, as the Honourable Member for Tewkesbury has highlighted, but I can say without hesitation that the legacy left by the last government on school funding and on educational outcomes is an overwhelmingly positive one, based on a relentless focus on sustained investment, principled reform and a clear commitment to inclusion. This is not just our record, it is the yardstick by which the current government must be judged. Our position today is consistent with that record. We support fair funding, we support the principles behind the dedicated schools grant, and we believe in the importance of local flexibility and accountability. We support the overarching aims of the Send and Alternative Provision Improvement Plan and the continuation of investment to support the transition to new national standards. But we also recognise the very real pressures that local authorities and schools are facing, because while funding has increased, so too has demand, and the current system is struggling to keep up. The number of pupils with education, health and care plans has more than doubled in the last decade. Local authorities up and down the country, Conservative, Labour and Liberal Democrat alike, are grappling with high need deficits, a growing wave of legal challenges and spiralling parental frustration. In my own constituency, SEND makes up an ever-growing proportion of casework, and I hear every week from parents struggling to secure the provision their child so desperately needs. Little wonder that the Public Accounts Committee of this House recently found that the current system risks creating a lost generation of children without intervention from central government. The National Audit Office was equally blunt in their 2024 report on SEND provision, which made it clear that without systemic reform, there will be systemic collapse. The crux of the matter is that as of January 2024, approximately 1.9 million children and young people in England were identified as having special educational needs, with 1.7 million attending school. Despite a 58% real terms increase in high needs funding over the last decade, reaching 10.7 billion in 2024 to 25, the system is not delivering improved outcomes for those children and young people. The financial strain this is placing local authorities under is deeply alarming. The NAO estimates that by March 2026, 43% of local authorities will have deficits exceeding or close to their reserves, leading to a cumulative deficit between 4.3 billion and 4.9 billion. This situation is exacerbated by the impending end of accounting arrangements that currently prevent these deficits from impacting local authority reserves. Without a clear plan to manage these deficits, many councils risk issuing Section 114 notices, effectively declaring bankruptcy. Moreover, the demand for education, health and care plans has surged by 140% since 2015, reaching 576,000 children in 2024. This increase, coupled with long waiting times, only 50% of EHC plans that were issued within the statutory 20-week target in 2023, has eroded confidence among families and children in the system's ability to meet statutory and quality expectations. Sadly, at the very moment clarity and support were most needed, the Education Secretary brought forward a bill that would do nothing less than destroy standards in English schools. No less serious are the broken promises on national insurance contributions compensation, which have left schools in an impossible funding situation. It has now been reported that some schools are facing funding gaps of up to 35% for these additional NIC costs. This shortfall will only exacerbate existing financial pressures, forcing schools to divert funds from essential services, potentially leading to loss of valued staff, a reduced capacity to accommodate pupils with special needs, and a generally lower standard of education provision. In summary, then, we are at a point where the government is asking councils to maintain high-quality provision, even as they manage large accumulated deficits, some exceeding 100 million, without knowing how or when these will be resolved. Schools are being asked to go further, faster on inclusion, without the confidence that adequate support services will be in place to back them up. At the same time, parents are being asked to trust in a system that all too often feels both overwhelming and overwhelmed. So today, I want to put a number of questions to the Minister, questions that reflect the concerns raised by members, by local authorities and by professionals across the education sector. First, on funding. The government has confirmed that it will continue funding local authorities through the dedicated schools grant for the foreseeable future. But what is the long-term plan for managing the high needs deficits that many councils have accrued? The current safety valve and delivering better value programmes provide some support, but they are not available to every authority and they don't provide a long-term solution. Will the Minister confirm whether the dedicated schools grant will remain a ring-fence grant beyond 2025? Will she guarantee that local authorities will not be forced to divert core council budgets to prop up SEND provision at the expense of other vital services? Secondly, on transparency and accountability, Colleagues today have spoken of the challenges their local schools face, not just in securing adequate funding, but in navigating a system that is complex, fragmented and adversarial. Parents are turning to tribunals in record numbers while local authorities are caught between an ever-growing web of statutory duties and finite budgets with which to deliver these. So what steps are the government taking to reduce the number of SEND tribunals, and what support will be offered to schools to manage rising levels of demand? Finally, I want to address the issue of place planning and capacity. One of the most frequent complaints we hear from local authorities is the mismatch between need and availability, particularly in relation to specialist settings. This is not just about funding, it is about the ability to plan, to build and to adapt provision to changing demographic and trends. Will the Minister set out what work has been done to support local authorities in expanding specialist provision where it is most needed? How will the Department ensure that capital investment keeps pace with rising demand, and what role does she see for the dedicated schools grant in ensuring sufficient places are available for all? I will end my long list of questions by thanking the Honourable Member for Tewkesbury for securing today's debate. The dedicated schools grant is a critical part of how we deliver education in this country. But if it is to work as intended, particularly in relation to SEND, then it must be fair, it must be transparent and it must be sustainable. I look forward to hearing from the Minister on how the government will make it so. Thank you.
Thank you. Minister Catherine McKinnell.
Thank you, Ms Butler, and it's a pleasure to serve under you as Chair today. And I congratulate the member for Tewkesbury on securing this debate on the dedicated schools grant and for his really important speech that he gave, and because this is such an important subject, and getting this right is a key part of achieving this Labour government's aim of breaking down those barriers to opportunity for every child and making sure that that link between background and success is truly broken. And that is why we are putting education back to the centre of national life again. And it's why we have prioritised education funding by increasing the overall core schools budget by £3.2 billion in 25 to 26, and that takes the overall core schools budget to £64.8 billion this year. And like many members have mentioned here today, I regularly visit schools in my constituency, and I know that individual schools face different challenges when it comes to their budgets. The unfunding spending commitments, which this government inherited, means that we do have to take tough decisions to restore the public finances. But I am proud that against that backdrop, we are putting money where our mouth is, and we are committing more funding to enable every child to achieve and to thrive. And of course, the Department for Education will continue to support teachers and school leaders to deliver on that as much as we can. We are ensuring that schools are supported to ensure that they spend their money as efficiently as they can while delivering on the best possible life chances to as many children as they can. And that means supporting them with best practice for budgeting and financial planning, supporting and mentoring for schools, business professionals, and giving hands-on support through school resource management advisors who provide independent and tailored advice to schools on how they can best maximise every pound that they spend. But more widely, the national funding formula distributes funding for mainstream schools, as we've discussed already, via the dedicated schools grant, and it is based on pupils' needs and characteristics so that we can direct that funding to where it's needed. In 2025 to 26, £5.1 billion of the school national funding formula has been allocated through deprivation factors, and 8.6 billion allocated for additional needs overall. And that's 17.8% of total core funding through the formula. So a pound in every five goes on those factors. And this does help schools in their vital work to close attainment gaps. But, I have listened very carefully to the debate today, but I have to reiterate that the purpose of the national funding formula, and I think honourable members do appreciate this, it's not to give every pupil the same level of funding per pupil. And it's because it's right that pupils that need additional investment attract that additional funding to be able to help school to respond to and meet their needs. And it does mean that schools in more expensive areas, such as London, attract higher funding per pupil to reflect the higher costs that being at school in London in terms of overall costs and the higher costs that are faced. But I am coming to the point, if I make my point and then I'm happy to give way, but I do recognise that schools have historically struggled with chaos and short-termism in school funding. And that's why in 2025 to 26, when we came into government, because of the timing of the general election, we wanted to give school that certainty about their funding and to minimise disruption for schools. So we prioritised keeping the same funding formula so that schools had certainty about, and we prioritised the speed of allocating that funding over any changes to the national funding formula that might have been made. But I can confirm that for 2026-27, we are reviewing the national funding formula. And I've listened very carefully to what's been said today, because we do recognise that importance of establishing a fair funding system that does direct funding to where it is most needed. Does the honourable gentleman still wish I give way?
When the government turns to that review in 2026-27 of the national funding formula, could the Minister set out what additional costs she expects to have to put into that formula that urban councils like Westminster might attract?
Minister.
So I think he'll appreciate I can't get into the detail of a particular local authority area or indeed a particular aspect of the funding. He will appreciate it is fairly complex, the national funding formula, and obviously any changes to it will be very, very carefully considered as to how we make sure that it is allocated fairly. But I appreciate the issues that the various honourable members have raised this evening about the different challenges that are faced in different parts of the country and through different demographics and through different geography, and obviously all of that will need to be taken into consideration. Members have also touched today on pay. In its written evidence to the review body, the department proposed a 2025 teachers' pay award of 2.8%, and we were clear that schools will be expected to fund this from overall funds they receive next year, including the additional £2.3 billion provided at the autumn budget. And the school's costs technical note that was published in March forecast a £400 million headroom in school budgets nationally in this financial year before staff pay awards. And as I said at the beginning, I do recognise that individual schools will have to balance funding and costs differently, and that will matter in how any staff pay award might affect their budgets. And we will continue to support schools as they navigate these decisions, which are in line with the asks of the rest of the public sector too. I give way.
Way. I recently met with a number of schools in my constituency too, and part of the problem that they've got in terms of balancing the books is the lack of ongoing sort of reasonable amounts of maintenance funding. I met with the Minister for Early Years last year about this. Will that be something that will be considered too when we're talking about funding allocation? Because in places like Harrogate, where we have schools which are hundreds of years old, the cost of maintaining those schools is just far outstrips new builds in urban areas.
So I do appreciate the challenge that the honourable gentleman brings, and indeed even I appreciate some of these capital challenges which are obviously revenue challenges as well for some schools. They are a big challenge, and we have seen chronic underinvestment in our school estate over many years. But indeed, as the honourable gentleman for Hexham has sadly experienced, along with his constituents, that a school built only 8 years ago is also crumbling now, it would appear. And so we do have a significant backlog of repairs and maintenance and support that has to be given to schools to get them up to a standard that they can deliver the education that we know children deserve. And obviously, we'll continue to look at these issues as we navigate a difficult financial situation, but very acutely aware of the challenges that many schools are facing in terms of the school estate. But fundamentally, at the foundation of each of our decisions is that determination to build a firm foundation from which to rebuild our public services. And some of that is in what we deliver, and some of that is in the infrastructure too. Because we are determined that all children and young people with special educational needs and disabilities also receive the right support to succeed in their education and as they move into adult life. High needs funding will increase by £1 billion in 25-26, and that brings the total high needs funding to over £12 billion. And of that total, Gloucester County Council is being allocated over £105 million to the high needs funding block, and an increase of over £8 million that's in the dedicated schools grant, and over £8 billion in the high needs national funding formula aspect calculated using the high needs formula. The high needs allocation is an 8.3% increase per head in the 2 to 18-year-old population compared to 24-25, and that is to support the ongoing costs of special educational needs and disability provision. And we do not, to be very clear, we do not expect that local authorities will use that increase in high needs funding to pay down historic deficits. The structure of the high needs funding is largely unchanged, and as I said, we do need to take time to consider what changes might be necessary in future years to make sure that it is fair and that it directs funding to where it is needed, and also supports any reforms that we want to bring forward in relation to special educational needs and disabilities. The government absolutely recognises the strain that the rising costs of special educational needs and disabilities provision are putting on local government, and that particular impact on councils' finances as well. And the statutory override is a temporary accounting measure which separates out local authorities' dedicated school grants deficits from their wider financial position to help them manage their deficits, and we are working with the sector to find a way forward. We will set out plans for reforming the SEND system in more detail later this year, and that will include supporting local authorities to deal with historic and accruing deficits as part of any transition period from the current SEND system to any new system. And it will inform any decision to remove the statutory override as well. I will give way.
I really thank the Minister for being generous with her time and giving way. I just wanted to push her on a point that she was talking about working with local authorities. I just wondered if she shared my concern that given that some councils now under reform control seem to be getting their instructions from diktat from their leader, is she disappointed, like I am, that no member of the Reform Party are here today on this important debate?
Minister.
I think the honourable gentleman made his point very well. But as a government, we are absolutely determined that local authorities can and will deliver those high-quality services for children and young people with special educational needs and disabilities, but that it is done in a financially sustainable way. And those two go hand in hand in terms of creating that stronger and more prosperous future for children and families, because we recognise that and I know many honourable members have spoken about experiences of their constituents, that too many families and children are not experiencing the quality of SEND services and provision that they should expect, but also that rising cost of SEND provision is putting a significant strain on both local authority and school finances. I will give way.
Thank you, Minister, for giving way. She describes the additional funding, but as I've explained, there's many parents and children that are suffering with severe mental health issues, and it's heartbreaking to see. The Liberal Democrats want to provide a dedicated mental health professional in every school so that every child and parent has got somebody to turn to when they need it. So what steps is the government putting in place to support parents and children who are facing mental health challenges?
Minister.
The Honourable Lady identifies a really important issue that, yes, we have a big challenge in relation to special educational needs and disabilities, but also we have a much wider challenge of significant challenges with mental health with young people right across our school system. The government's absolutely committed to ensuring we have mental health professionals in every school and also in every community as well, to make sure that children and families can get that support, whether it's in a school setting or indeed outside of a school setting, if that's where they feel they want to access it. Honourable members will appreciate that we have our current spending review ongoing. It's due to conclude in June, but our objective is to ensure that local authorities, schools and colleges can deliver those high quality services for children and young people with SEND, and we will set out in more detail how local authorities will deal with their historic deficits as well as part of that consideration. So I want to thank the Honourable Member for Tewkesbury again for bringing this matter forward, and for all who have contributed to what I think is a very thoughtful debate, and I think there is a large amount of consensus on certainly what we want to achieve for children and young people in relation to getting the best outcomes from our dedicated schools grant. The government has made clear its commitment to addressing the challenges as part of supporting children and young people to achieve and thrive, and I am determined that progress will be made. So I want to give my final word of thanks to all those who work in our school system in the interest of our children and young people in Gloucestershire and across the country. And indeed, I realise I did mean to come back to the Honourable Gentleman for Hexham to particularly commend the school staff who have been working incredibly hard at Prudhoe Community High School to minimise the impact on the children and young people who are taking their GCSE exams in particular, and A-levels as well, and BTECs and T-levels and all of the assessments that are going on this summer. We know that school leaders and teachers are working tirelessly, regardless of any debate we have in this place about school funding or otherwise, to deliver the best outcomes for the children in their area, and they should know they have a government that is on their side, that will support them to deliver that, despite the very challenging economic circumstances that we have inherited. Because we need to deliver the very best for all our children and young people. And we have pledged to review the funding system to help support and achieve this.
Thank you. Cameron Thomas to wind up.
Thank you, Chair. To wind up, I thank all of my honourable colleagues for their speeches. The gallant member for Honiton and Sidmouth equated the differential in funding to an entire teacher's salary. The member for Hexham contextualised the crisis faced by constituents with inadequate transport infrastructure and unfit buildings. I will join him in thanking our teaching staff for their inspiring work ethic. The member for Thornbury and Yate explained how her diverse constituency suffers from being not rural enough, and not urban enough. Her young people do deserve more. The member for Glastonbury and Somerton highlighted the legacy inequity locked in to the current system, and the member for Taunton and Wellington called on the national funding formula to reflect current need, not historic need. The member for North Norfolk broadened the picture by explaining that families are having less children because they struggle to support even themselves. I thank the Liberal Democrat spokesperson, the member for St Neots and Mid-Cambridgeshire, whom spoke of the postcode lottery perpetuated by a systemically flawed funding formula. I thank the opposition spokesperson, who joined our call to review the national funding formula, even if her recollection of her party's record differs from the rest of the country, not least my teachers. I thank the Minister who described her ambition to put education at the heart of the government's national rebuild. I'm pleased that the government will commit to reviewing the national funding formula, and I'm sure she won't mind if my colleagues and I chalk that one up to this debate. Once more, Madam Chair, I thank you for the honour to bring this debate under your chairship. Thank you.
The question is this House has considered dedicated schools grant? As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order, order. Suspended Sitting suspended until 6. Order.